Greetings gamers, my name is Anto, welcome into the stream. This evening we're going to be doing some design work for my in-progress sci-fi system, which is currently codenamed Project Cobalt. I've talked about this a little on the channel before. We've done a stream or two about it. I've done some members content and I talk about it on my Discord and Patreon a whole bunch, but I wanted to do some work on it this evening because I recently ran some playtest games and there's some bits and pieces that I want to tweak about the character sheets and some updates that I want to make to some of the written stuff that I've got going on in the rules. So that is the plan for this evening. I have just double checked and I am broadcasting audio, which is always a good sign. I'm just going to tweak my audio levels in my ear holes because as always I'm listening to different music than you are. But as we always do with these streams, as we're going through, get involved in the chat, ask questions, tell me how your day is going, tell me what TTRPG related things you've been up to while I push the buttons, twirl the dials and get ready for this whole shindig. Let's switch over to this desktop view so you can see this is the current Google Doc that I've got going on for the rules for Project Cobalt, the in-progress sci-fi RPG. And I have been working away in my downtime this week since running my couple playtest sessions to kind of codify my rules a little bit and mainly get all of my notes into one place, because I ran 2 playtest sessions of this over the last month and my notes were just everywhere. I had them in like 3 different Google Docs, in Publisher, in Designer, in Legend Keeper, in the Notes app on my phone, and trying to find where I had things written down in the moment while trying to run it was a pure nightmare. So I wanted to put something together mainly for myself. This isn't the version that will get pushed out to people, though I do want to get this out to people before the end of the year. I think I want a playtest packet out to folks to start getting this onto more tables for more rigorous testing. Now that I have started to test it with other people and not just playing with myself. But this doc is mainly for my benefit and starting to think about how I will express some of these rules in the final written form. So you see kind of a blend of kind of scratch note kind of things and then some more kind of like rigorous design language stuff as we go through this. Terry says, hey Anto, I've watched your videos for some time now, though this is my first live stream of yours. Welcome in, glad to have you here. Normally we do a bunch of like fantasy world building for my D&D sessions and stuff in the live streams. This is slightly different to what we usually do, but we have done a couple of these so far. As we go through the evening, I also have in the face cam a little dice tray so I can roll dice and show you examples. It's very hard for me to see because there's a bunch of equipment between it and me, so I roll them and I have to look in the screen to see what the result is, but we'll work with it. So we can do some live examples of how the game will work and things like that. So that should be good. And then if we jump over into this view, I also have my Affinity Designer and Affinity Publisher. Yeah, Affinity Publisher loaded and ready, so I can pull those up as we go through if we need to reference anything as well. Also have a whole bunch of spreadsheet related stuff. Oh, this bloody Google and its fucking automated AI crap. I hate it. And I also have a whole bunch of other tabs open that we'll get to. So the first thing that I want to do this evening is kind of give you a run through of what worked in the playtest and what didn't work, and kind of an overview of the core system and the core dice resolution mechanic. So for those of you that are joining for the first time who have no idea what this whole thing is, you can get some sense of what is going on with this. So we are going to, I'm just looking, I had a notification. I wanted to make sure it wasn't someone being like, yo, problem with the stream, but it was fine. So Project Cobalt is going to be a pulp sci-fi TTRPG. What does that mean? It means that I am not interested in hard sci-fi and the kind of super scientific elements of a sci-fi game. Like, I don't care how a spaceship makes its artificial gravity. All I care about is if the artificial gravity drive is damaged, that is dramatic for the characters. Like, I'm not interested in spending a lot of time figuring out relative velocities and doing a bunch of maths and physics as a player or as a GM. I am only interested in sci-fi as being an interesting and evocative backdrop for the setting and for the game to take place in. So it's not a system where I want to spend a lot of time kind of agonizing over whether or not something is or isn't possible, or whether it would work exactly like how the rules present it. This is more, it's more like Star Wars and less like The Expanse, I guess. Historically, I would have been like more like Star Wars, less like Star Trek, but I think The Expanse is probably a better modern example of something that takes the science a little bit more seriously. More George Lucas, less Andy Weir. That kind of end of the spectrum. We want fast-paced pulp stories versus more meticulous, like grounded in reality kind of hard science. So that is one of the first things when I was writing out the summary is, and this is something I do in all projects, is I start by kind of making a summary and then talk about what my design goals are. And this is really helpful as a designer, because every time you are including something and introducing new mechanics, you can always reference, well, what are my core goals? Because either the thing that I'm introducing will serve these core goals, will add to them, or it'll work against them. And if it works against them, it shouldn't be in the game. So the core design goals, the game should be fast-paced. I specifically want actions to resolve quickly. I don't want to spend 2 hours in one combat. I want rapid, fast-paced firefights where things happen really quickly. The kind of status quo swings and roundabouts changes dramatically. The game should be narrative first. So I want the players describing the cool stuff that they're doing first and foremost, and then figuring out how to do that in the mechanics second. And that has informed how a lot of the mechanics have worked. And then it's pulp sci-fi action. So the rule of cool comes first. So you're never going to be worried about how the artificial gravity generator works. It's just, if it breaks, bad news for the players. Bob says maybe have the speed rules as optional rules, cater for those who want the maths. I mean, if you want to play a sci-fi game that has a more robust system for like maths and physics, and there are games out there that do that. Like, I am not interested in trying to cater to everyone. I am not interested in trying to make a game that is going to appeal to everyone. Like, if someone wants to play a more in-depth sci-fi system, my very first thought would be Traveller. Traveller has a whole bunch of rules involved in it. Not all of them are required. You can add or remove rules as you want. But it's just one of many sci-fi games that takes that sort of more like hard sci-fi edge that I'm personally not interested in exploring in the RPG space. Terry says, also as a lifelong gamer, I consider myself a creative type. I've always had the desire to get into game designing, though my ADHD has always derailed me. I'd love to pick your brain sometime and maybe even collab if you'd be open to that. Always happy to have my brain picked. I'll put a link to the Discord server if the links are going to work today. They are going to work today. If you want to jump into the Discord server, we have a whole bunch of areas in there for game masters and players and off topic and stuff for folks to talk about all kinds of TTRPG related things. It's a great place to pick people's brains and get ideas and stuff. So, core mechanics for the currently titled Project Cobalt. This will not be its final name. I just need a working title, because otherwise I would have been agonizing over this thing needs a name. So the core mechanic is it's going to be a D6 dice pool based system. If we jump over into Affinity Designer and double check that that's viewing properly, yes it is, and I'll show you a character sheet and I'll explain how this works with the character sheets. So every character has attributes, which are strength, reflex, nerve, intellect, and charm, and then skills. Whole bunch of skills. It's a skill monkey system, so everything you do, you'll be doing broadly with skills. And anytime that you do something that has a chance of failure, you're going to be making an action roll, and that is made by combining one of your attributes with one of your skills. Now, in most situations, one of those elements is going to be determined by what you want to do. If you want to shoot your gun, then you're going to be using the gun skill. But the other element of that is going to be determined by the narrative, the circumstance, the situation. So by default, if you were going to be shooting your gun, you would usually use your reflex, like the reflexes of shooting your gun. But there may be sometimes when you use something like your nerve, like keeping your cool, like a standoff style gunslinger showdown, or your intellect if you were trying to target a specific point and use your intelligence to know which weak points to target on like a mech or a ship or something like that. So the whole point of the attribute and skill system is that one of them will almost always be fixed in the situation, but the other will be more loosey-goosey and more open to interpretation and more of a discussion between the GM and the players of, well, this is going to be your default go-to. So if you want to shoot your gun, guns and reflex is always going to be a safe bet. But if you can justify using guns and intellect, let's say you want to use your big brain to figure out how to curve a shot around a wall, bouncing it off something like Wanted style, then you can do that if the circumstances allow. And then you build up your dice pool. So in this example, we would have 3 points from our reflex skill, 2 points from guns. And if we jump over to the face cam and open up our dice tray, to make the action roll for reflex and guns, we would roll 5 dice and we'd be looking for at least 1 6. Here we have 2, which would be a success. And we've also got an additional 6, which is a critical success. I don't know what the name for the critical success is going to be yet, but you can spend those additional 6s to do cool stuff. So if we jump back over into the big old list of stuff and find multiple successes. So when you're making an action roll and you roll more than 1 6, you can spend those 6s to perform additional actions. Each additional 6 can be spent to do one of the following. So you can deal extra damage when you're making an offensive action. You can move up to 4 squares. You can mark a target so your allies get an extra dice on their next attack against the target. You can hug cover, which will impart a -1 dice modifier on an attack that targets you. You can interact with an extra item in a turn, or if you are making part of a joint roll, you can allow a friend to succeed. So that's a way to not penalize the whole group if one person fails. Have you ever fired 2 guns while jumping through the air? It's exactly the vibe we want. Terry says this reminds me a lot of a game that I played in a one-shot not too long ago. I can't remember the name of what it is. There are a bunch of systems that are skill monkey systems and dice pool systems where you build attributes and skills in some form. So things like Vampire Masquerade is one with D10s. The Year Zero engine, I think, uses dice pools. Dice pools as a general resolution mechanic are one of the more common ones. I think I'd say they're probably the most common after like D20. Like D20 systems, then dice pool systems in some variety. It's just the way in which you determine successes changes. Some of them you need to roll, in this case, at least 1/6. Some of them it's you add them all together and you have to beat the target number. But like building dice pools, fairly common way to build up a to resolve action in TTRPGs. So if we scroll back up to the top for action rolls, so the intention is for the players to describe the action, decide on their attribute and skill, build their dice pool, and then apply modifiers. So modifiers are going to be things like if your target is in cover, they are going to get extra armor, but if they're hugging cover, if you're hugging cover because you've got an extra 6, there'd be a modifier on the enemies because they get a -1 dice to their pool. Or if you've marked a target, your allies will get +1 dice to their dice pool. But the most common modifier is going to be from adrenaline, which is the other kind of core system to the game. Anytime you fail an action roll, you gain a point of adrenaline. And adrenaline is determined by how much nerve you have. So the more nerve a character has, the more adrenaline they can have. And you can spend adrenaline on a 1-to-1 basis to add more dice to your dice pool when you're making action rolls. So as you fail at things, it means that your future rolls are going to be more likely to succeed. And then you can also spend adrenaline to do other stuff. So you can use it to add dice to other people's rolls at a 2-to-1 ratio. So you can spend 1 adrenaline to add 1 dice to your roll, 2 adrenaline to add 1 dice to another person's roll, or you can spend 3 adrenaline to heal 1 point of health to yourself. And as the game expands, I want to add more ways for adrenaline to be used through kind of archetype features, class features, as well as when you get those extra 6s, I want there to be kind of class features that allow you to do like signature abilities by burning adrenaline on those 6s to do like the most bounty hunterist bounty hunter thing that you can do. But that's all stuff that's going to come later down the line once the core of the system is in a really strong place, and I know it's not going to like move too much. Because at the moment it's so early on that all of the core things are like constantly in flux. Bob says, can you spend adrenaline to make the enemy lose 1 die? That's an interesting concept that I think I would be open to having be something that at least one of the archetypes could probably do. Not necessarily on a 1-to-1 basis, maybe a 2-to-1. Or like figure out the ratio, but having at least one of the characters, the archetypes, being able to kind of disrupt player enemy attacks would be a really cool option. And something that I am going to do as we go through this is going to jump back into the notes here. And we're going to go up to the top after the change log. And we're going to make a new page break. And then we're going to have a scratch notes page so that I can keep note of all of the things that come up during this live stream and whilst I'm going through and doing other things. So an archetype feature to spend adrenaline to minus enemy action rolls. It's far too early to not be able to type. That is, we can't be starting this already. So one thing that I want to do this evening, as I said, is kind of go through some of the stuff that came up in the playtest session and make some adjustments based on that. So whilst we were doing the playtest session, did 2 distinct sessions and I made a bunch of changes in between. And if we jump over into Affinity Designer here, I can show off some of those. So you can see here, this is my design spread for the character sheets. And we've got 2 different versions here. If I just get rid of the sidebars here, or maybe I need that one back so I can move it to make it a little easier to see. Just move it over like that. There we go. So on the right hand side here, this is the older version of the character sheet, and then the left hand side is the newer version of the character sheet. And we're just going to just do that and hide the secret goals for a moment. There we go. So the old version of the character sheet is the one that used in the first playtest session, and the new version is the one that used in the second playtest session. The first playtest session was fine, but it was very obvious, not even halfway through, that I had made a mistake in the number of skill and attribute points that I'd given the players. So you can see here that we'll take, for example, guns. So the bounty hunter in the first playtest version had 2 in reflex and 2 in guns, so a 4 dice pool total. Now, with the way that the math works in this, a 4 dice pool total is a 52% success chance, which, while it's more than 50%, so they were succeeding more than half the time, it's not high enough for the players to feel like they're succeeding enough of the time. Generally speaking, if you want the players to feel like they are succeeding enough, you need to be hitting around 60% when you look at the math of D&D, for example. And you compare how the players to hit bonus compares to the average AC of a monster all the way through. It sits at about 65 to 70%, depending on the level. And you know, when there is randomness through dice rolls, you always have the chance for things to go wrong and for the rolls to be awful. Like in our second session, one player rolled 9 dice and didn't roll a single 6. So there's always the chance of failure. But for the players to feel emotionally like they are succeeding, you want to be hitting that 60 plus success rate. And I just had not given them enough skills on that first session. So in that first session, I could feel that they were miserable because they were just failing and failing and failing. So a big part of what I did in between sessions was rejig how attributes and skills worked as starting characters, so you got more of them. So characters could have at least a couple of things, a couple of skills where they could be reasonably assured that they were going to get those 4 or 5 or 6 dice pool action rolls right from the start. Because otherwise it was just miserable. Bob says if 6 is success, is 1 a failure? So currently 1 has no bearing at all. It's just 6. 1 or more 6s is a success. And if you fail to roll any 6s, it is a failure. Because the design intention is fast-paced, pulpy action, I don't want people having to tally things up in a typical roll. It's very easy to just roll an enormous fistful of dice and just look for a single 6 and know whether you've succeeded or not. And then if you've got more than 1 6, you can spend them to do extra cool stuff. But if there are no 6s, you failed, you take an adrenaline, you add an adrenaline point to your tracker so that you can be better in the future, and the action moves on. And that is one of the other ways to try and limit that kind of feels bad, because in something like D&D or in a system like Pathfinder or any of the D20 systems, or a lot of the D20 systems, you can go for a really long time between your turns. It's not uncommon for a player to go 30 plus minutes between their turns. So if you come up to your turn and you do nothing, it really sucks if you're waiting half an hour before you get to do something again. But in a system like this that is designed for an entire combat to not last, that 30 minutes, you are going to be going through your turns really quickly because the player is going to describe what they do. They're going to roll a bucket of dice. They're going to fish for sixes, and the resolution happens very, very quickly. By the time we were playing the second playtest session, the combats were moving much more quickly, and by the time we got to the end of that session, the boss fight that we had went really snappy because everyone was finally up to speed with the system, knew what they were doing, and one of the players remarked when it came back around to their turn that they liked how quickly they were able to get back around and act again. So the kind of core premise of combat within the system is things move at a clip, which is part of what is meant to be like reducing the feels bad. Like if you fail, it's fine because it's only going to be a few minutes until it comes back around and you get another go. Bob says, I like the idea of epic failures, so the only way it would be of epic failures, so the only way this would be all ones on the dice. All ones on the dice as something catastrophic happening would be quite funny. There is a system for like very high stakes rolls. It's called the Last Stand presently, and if I jump to that, so some situations are going to be more intense than others from a narrative standpoint, and I wanted to add something to represent that. So currently it's called the Last Stand, and the idea is that it comes at the end of like a cascade of failures. So you're trying to defuse a bomb, you fail, you try again, you fail again, then the GM would be like, right, if you fail another time, we're going to be in a last stand. And the way it works is that the GM rolls one dice for each player that's present at the table, always rolling in the open. Everything in the system is designed so that the GM rolls in the open because you're fishing for sixes. I think it's more interesting and exciting if everyone can see the dice. But the GM rolls one dice for every player present, and then you go around and each player rolls one dice individually, and you're comparing the results. So if we go to the dice tray view, and we'll use two different colored dice for this. So I'll use black for the GM. So the GM would roll one for each of the players. So in this case, the GM doesn't get any sixes. And then you would go one at a time through each of the players, hoping to get a six if you can get the dice in the tray. In which case, in this example, we get no sixes. So you would then tally up the totals, which is, I think, a tie. It is a tie. I can't remember whether I've put anything for the ties. I haven't. I don't think. High five is the winner. I have not put what happens during a tie. So I will have to add that to my list of things that need to be sorted. What happens in a last stand tie? Sort the dice tray back out, and then turn that back off. And we want scratch notes. What happens in a last stand tie? Nope, that was the wrong one. The bottom says quick action keeps players engaged and on point. Sometimes when it's been a long time, it's very easy to get distracted and take even longer on your turn. Exactly. Which is a big thing that I want to avoid, because having been a GM for a long time, anyone that has will recognize the situation where you've got 5 players and it might be 30 minutes between a player's go and their next go, and you see them completely like glaze over, disconnect from everything that's happening at the table, and when you get back round to their turn, they've got no idea what's going on in the scene, they've got no idea what they want to do, they've got no idea who they are or where they are. So the fast-paced, frenetic action helps keep people involved, because there's never a long time between your next go, and things are always happening. So if you kind of zone out a little, it's easy to miss things. Excuse me. So if we jump over into the designer, losing my words. So in the first session, I'd given players far too few skills. So in between the first and second playtest session, rework things so that the players were going to get a lot more skills. So initially they had 7 attribute skills and 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11-ish skill points. I upped that in the second playtest session so that they would have 9 attribute points, and then they got more skills. So they got more skills from their background, and they got more skills to freely choose as well. And that went a long way to making a big difference in that second playtest session for each character feeling like there was at least 1 or 2 things that they were going to be really good at. So like the bounty hunter, for example, is rolling 5 dice on guns, which if I double check my dice probability, and this is another thing that I've done in my Google Doc, is I've included the dice probability chart right at the top so I can always reference it. And this is something that I would do in the finished product as well. This dice probability would be very prominently placed so that GMs would always be able to look and see how likely it is that something is going to be a success, depending on the number of dice in an action roll for any given situation. Because that kind of knowledge is power as a GM. So if you want to like put together a quick monster, and you want to be like, right, I want this monster to be hitting 70% of the time. I want it to hit a lot, but only do a little bit of damage. Cool, I know it needs like 7 dice in its dice pool. Great. Awesome. Bob says that there are temporary buffs and debuffs for things like nerve reflex strength from things like booze and medicine. Way too early for that. There may be, but there are. If we go over to the health section, you can see that there is a rollable little d6 thing for conditions. So as part of the health system and death and dying, if you're brought to 0 hit points and you don't die, when you are back up, you receive a condition, and it'll either be a case of the GM assigns the condition based on the narrative situation of the scene, or there are 6 conditions so that the GM has the option to roll if they don't feel comfortable bestowing negative things on the player at their choice. So originally in the first version of this sheet there was only 5, and I added a 6th one because I could envision table scenarios where you go down and the GM says, right, when you went down then that broke your arm, and the GM declares it, and the player pushes back against that and is like, well, why did it break my arm? Can't it have like cracked my ribs? Because that would be better for them. So given the option of it being a rollable thing and leaving it to chance and let the player roll it, that removes that player GM confrontation if you don't want it there. And there'll be guidance in the final thing to be like, this is an option if you want to just roll it and not have to deal with deciding which of your players' abilities is going to get nerfed. But each condition has like a negative associated with it. So blood loss means any healing you receive is less effective. Broken arm means that you are less effective whenever you're using something that requires 2 hands. So if you're making an action roll with something that requires 2 hands, firing a 2-handed weapon, anything like that, you'll take a -1 dice penalty. Concussed means that anytime you make an action roll with intellect or charm, you have a -1 dice to your action roll. Cracked ribs is the same but for strength and reflex, and shocked is the same for nerve. And then weakened means anytime you take damage, you always take 1 more damage than you otherwise would. And then, like I said, typically the player is going to roll that when they get back up from their dying state. So at the moment, the way dying works is you have 10 health to start with. Once your health hits 0, you are out cold and dying. While you are dying, at the start of your turn, you lose 1 point of adrenaline. If you start your turn with no adrenaline, you are dead. So that's another way that the adrenaline system is really key to characters. You always want to have some adrenaline because it's going to keep you alive. The broken arm will also depend on which hand. The dominant arm and one-handed actions will also be effective. Way too granular for pulp sci-fi. Like, in this sort of fast-paced pulp world, everyone's ambidextrous. Like, that level of minutia is always going to be a case of, if we were that specific, then you've always got a case of either the GM has to make that call, in which case there's no reason not to always target the dominant hand, if it is a situation where the call can be made, or the player's never going to choose the dominant hand, or it's a second level of like randomness that you have to put in. Gambling says, why is the lack of adrenaline bad? I don't know why, but it feels like it should be too much adrenaline. Max is death. No. So adrenaline is the currency, the name for the second currency. You can think of it as luck, as a second name if you want, and it's just that as you're dying, the conceptually it's as you're dying, as long as you've got some adrenaline flooding through you, it's keeping you alive, and once you're out of adrenaline, your body's kind of like given up, and it's more to tie it into adrenaline being kind of touched into all areas of the game. So there's always something to do with that kind of secondary resource. Like, every time you fail, you get a point of adrenaline, and then you can spend it to improve your rolls, to improve friends' rolls, to heal yourself. You need it to keep some back if you're going to die. You want to make sure that, it'll keep you alive for a couple turns. So it's kind of like the meta currency with which you will interact with your character. So that was the conditions. So between the first and second playtest session, the biggest change I made was increasing the number of skill points and attribute points that the players had, and also getting rid of a couple of skills. So in the first session, the players encountered some computer systems and used hacking on them, which is one of the skills. And then looking at the skills after the fact, originally computers was its own distinct separate skill. And looking at that, I was like, I can't think of a situation where it would make sense for a player to use computers as a skill that couldn't also be justified by hacking, in terms of an action role where there's a chance for failure and consequences to the failure, that kind of thing. So part of it was removing some kind of dead skills, and that will be a big part of the playtest process, is going through and fine-tuning the skills and figuring out which skills need to stay, which ones earn their place, and which ones just consistently don't get used. So immediately I was like, computers and hacking cover enough of the same space. Anything that hacking doesn't cover, tech will probably cover. So computers as a kind of discrete skill can go, at least for now. And then same with 0G. So I knew that I wanted there to be something to do with 0G in going into the first session, but I had no concrete idea what it was. And then between sessions, I workshopped it a little more. And the current idea is that if you are operating in 0G, you have flat penalties to everything that you're trying to do, unless you have the 0G skill, which gives you a bonus bonus is the wrong word because it's just negating some of the penalties. So a character that has 2 points in 0G is as effective in 0G as they are in full gravity. Which is where the pilot really shines, because out the gate they have 2 points in 0G. So if you are playing in like the playtest adventure and you end up having a 0G battle, the pilot is suddenly significantly better than everyone else in that fight because they have no penalties, whereas everyone else would be suffering. So that was a lot of what I was doing in between those sessions, was kind of like tweaking the skill system, trying to make it a little bit more obvious where skills were coming from. You can see with a little of this color coding, using the blue tone for archetype, this red tone for background, and then the black for any freely selected choices. As I go forward, I will probably make each of these a distinct shape as well, because if you're printing this off in black and white, or if you've got a color deficiency, there's not enough contrast between these three colors to be able to tell what they are. So that is something that I want to do. Make sure, kind of rearrange this, give some space to have a little key for archetype, like blue diamond, background, red circle, and free select, black triangle, or whatever the symbols are going to be. Just to make it clear on the pre-generated sheets where the skills and the attributes are coming from, because I'm a big fan of doing everything you can so that a player can look at a character sheet, be told the core resolution mechanic, and then understand most of the game from those two things. Like, when I look at new TTRPGs, when I'm doing stuff for the channel and doing reviews and things like that, a well-written system, I can usually just go to the page where it tells me how the combat resolution works, and then go to the character sheet, and that will inform me of most of the things that I need to know about how like an average round of a game is going to go. So I'm spending a lot of time to try and make it as clear as possible without having to look anywhere else, just looking at the character sheet, how this game works. Gambling says, is there a bonus in full gravity if you don't have 0G, similar to the Expanse where people from Mars struggle on Earth? No, currently. I doubt there will be, just because, again, the intention is pulp sci-fi rather than going too granular and nitty-gritty with it, because I think there are already really good granular sci-fi games for the people that want that kind of level of specificity, whereas I feel like, as someone that wants something more pulp, I feel like I'm always fighting against the systems in those games to get the more like Star Wars serialized kind of adventure type stories that I like to tell and I prefer to play in. Bob says, so far it seems only gun combat is a skill for melee combat. There is. So there is a combat skill. So guns is for guns. Combat is for any melee thing. Explosives covers a gamut of most things that explode. And then you have heavy weapons, which is for heavy weapons. That can cover things like, in our second playtest session, the mercenary shot the rocket pod arm off of the mech that they were fighting, and then used that rocket pod as like a mobile gun platform, and heavy weapons was what he used as the action roll for that. Gambling says, I'm super interested in the combat. How do you keep it dynamic rather than players hunkering down because it's all at range, etc.? So the elements of encouraging players to be dynamic with it is not sticking to that kind of hyper realistic element. So it's something that I've kind of rubbed up against, had a little bit of problem with a couple times while I've been going through the design. Realistically speaking, any gun that you're going to use on most kind of modern RPG battle maps they should be hitting absolutely everything on that map at the ranges that they're realistically operating at. But that doesn't make for good gameplay if you can hit everything all at the time with no problems. Everyone is always going to hunker down because there's no need to move. So part of it is intentionally making the guns shorter range than they really would be. So for example, if we jump over to the page, the docs note, and then we look for the example weapons table. So ranges are first and foremost in zone brackets: close, near, far, extreme, and then there is a kind of range for that in recommended squares, distance in feet, and distance in meters. So close range is immediately around you, within 1 square of you, 5 feet. If you were playing with like D&D sizing, 1.5 meters as the recommended. Near range is 8 squares, so 40 feet. Far range is 20 squares or 100 feet, and then extreme range is anything over 20 squares or 100 feet. And then a kind of rider that is like, if your weapon can shoot at extreme range, it can shoot anything that you can reasonably see, and whether you can reasonably see it is largely going to be up to the GM, depending on what your weapon is, what you've got. You know, obviously a sniper rifle with a long range scope is going to be able to see something that's like 500 meters away, but a regular rifle might not be able to. So the extreme range is much more nebulous and much more narrative than like a battle map focus. But really speaking, all modern and sci-fi guns would be able to hit everything within these ranges, which would result in everyone always hunkering down because there'd be never any need to move. So part of the way to encourage that dynamism and getting people to move around is artificially limiting the ranges, because you want people to be moving closer so they don't get penalties. You want people to be using their abilities which might require them to be in certain ranges. So if we look at the weapons table, for example, you can see that there's kind of color and shape coded markers for everything. So we'll use the shotgun as an example. If you are shooting at something that is in near range with a shotgun, you will deal 5 damage to them. But if you're shooting at something that is in close range, it's got a gold diamond, which denotes that there's a special rule at that range, distance. And if you're shooting at something at close range with a shotgun, it deals 8 damage. So you're always incentivized with the shotgun to consistently close the distance. Same with the SMG. The SMG does the same damage, but if you are at close range, you can shoot at 2 targets. The ability is called spray and pray. It's the idea of getting up close with that small like personal defense weapon and just spraying at the enemies that are right in front of you. And like if you have like a heavy machine gun, like more of a turret mounted machine gun, that might be able to do that similar sort of target multiple spray and pray kind of thing at further ranges. Similarly, you can see like the sniper rifle just does not work at close range. If someone's in your face, you can't shoot them with the sniper rifle. You can't bring the barrel to bear and that kind of thing. So that's one way that it encourages players to move around. And the other way is, so far, there is no like attacks of opportunity or anything like that, because that really bogs people down. Anytime you disincentivize movement, the game becomes much more static. And given that the intention is really fast-paced combat, I don't think that I see myself adding attacks of opportunity style elements where you're discouraged from moving away from someone that you're next to. It may be that adds something in terms of like modifiers and things, and the cover system encourages you to be near to someone because you can use other people as cover after a fact. So if we go to the cover section, which is When another character is between you and your target has light cover unless the other character is within close range or 1 square of the target, in which case they have heavy cover. So currently there's no rules for like shooting another person that is providing that cover, but that's part of the reason why you would want to like stay close to an enemy and keep them between you or your friend or like their friend even, because they're going to give you a little bit of a buff to your armor, because you are like in there in the mix and in melee. So I don't want to discourage people moving around and being high energy and like high dynamic action, which I think is what happens if you say, right, okay, if as soon as you are close to someone, if you try and leave, they're just going to slip a knife between your ribs. Bob says vehicular combat, not just space. Eventually, there will be rules for that kind of stuff. Currently, the space is handled by this sheet, which is the character sheet for an example ship called the Nightingale. This is the ship that you have in the starter adventure. And the idea is that, similar to how normal combat works, it will be like a narratively described scene where the players are making action rolls to do different things. So the pilot will be piloting the ship, doing barrel rolls, doing all the cool stuff. And if your ship has a number of weapons on it, different people can mount the weapons and shoot back at the targets. And then when it comes to the ships taking damage, whenever you take damage, you assign the damage to both the hull and one of the systems of the ship. So let's say the Nightingale was to take 2 points of damage. You'd assign 2 points of damage to the hull and then 2 points of damage among these systems as well. So you might put 1 point in cargo and 1 point in critical systems. If any of these critical systems fills up, they go offline, and that can have really dramatic consequences or mechanical consequences. You know, if your engine takes 4 points of damage, your engine is going to go offline and you'll be dead in the water. You'll have no propulsion. If your weapons go offline, you can't shoot back. If your cargo is overloaded, you might lose all of the stuff that you were carrying for your job. You know, the cargo bay might vent into space. If the critical systems go offline, you might lose oxygen, and etc, etc. And there'll be ways for the players to use their action rolls to repair these systems, which will repair the points on the systems, but not to the hull. And then if the hull reaches its max, the ship explodes. Bob says if you were to have opportunity attacks, then as an archetype, but the counter will be they're worse at something else, so not always worth it, but another archetype might be better. Yeah, if opportunity attacks were to be a thing, it would probably be limited to one archetype or one feature, like not a universal thing, rather than being something that just everyone can get access to, because it does just encourage people to stay in place. And then if we jump back over to the regular character sheets, something that I do think that I am going to change is the expression of inventory. So currently it is meant to be that you have a number of slots, 6 plus 3 times your strength score. So in the case of our bounty hunter here, they have 3, 6, 9, 12 slots. And then every item takes up a number of slots, but certain small items you can fit 3 per slot. In text, that works fine, but in visual form, something that kept consistently happening in the playtest sessions is that the players would look at like this stim shot here where there's 3 of them and would assume that that is 3 slots and not 1 slot with 3 smaller items in it. So that's something I'm going to keep an eye on in playtesting to see if that's something that keeps coming up as a misunderstanding or a miscommunication with players. And if it does, I will just change the presentation of slots, and instead of being like 6 plus 3 times strength, I'll just triple those numbers so that each of these little kind of third of a slot currently becomes a full slot. And instead of the modified alliance body armor taking up 2 slots, it takes up 6. And then there's no confusion as to how that works. I'm leaning more towards that anyway, because then it gives me the scope to be able to say you can interact with 1 slot items specifically as a mechanical thing within other elements of the rules. And then as I'm designing items, I know that if I don't want that item to be able to be interacted with in that way, I just make it 2 or more slots. So I'm leaning more towards that just anyway. And that is probably the way I will go. Terry says the inventory system is very much Mutant Year Zero. Like, it's very similar to a lot of a whole bunch of systems. Most systems that aren't D&D will use some sort of slot-based inventory. In my experience, it's much more common to find slot inventory than it is to find like poundage. Like even with when Pathfinder went from first to second edition, they moved. Did they move to slots? They may have in the playtest. I know there was talk of slots. In Starfinder, there was definitely slots. But slot-based inventory is very, very common. Because it means you have to do far less maths. And even though I love maths, I was a maths kid, but I know that especially among common players of TTRPGs, people do not like doing maths. So my goal is to always limit the amount of maths that you need to do. And it's easy to be like, okay, I've got this many slots on my sheet and fill it in a very visual medium versus being like, right, okay, I need to bust out my calculator and work out how many eighths of a pound I've got spare to be able to carry these things. Hector, welcome in. What else have we changed? Let's jump back over to the Google Doc. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff. So we'll go character creation summary. So for the character creation, again, looking at this from the point of view of new players, making it as easy as possible to make a character and like the accessibility element of it. When I was going through the process of framing characters, very much wanted an ABC system because I think it is the easiest one to describe to a new player. I think mnemonics are very easy to get across to a new player, and if you can just be like, right, you choose an archetype, a background, a core talent, you make your decisions on all your things, and then deal with everything else. So it's A, B, C, D, E. And that is how you build your character. So you start by choosing what archetype you want to play, choose your background, then core talent. This hasn't come into the pre-gens yet. None of them have their core talents. Then you make your decisions. So that's choosing where to place your remaining attribute and skill points, what to spend your credits on, and then everything else. So that's appearance, background details, all the other stuff that needs to go on the sheet. Currently, there are the 6 archetypes. So we have the bounty hunter, the corpo agent, the mercenary, the scientist, the smuggler, and the ace pilot. All of this art is done by Hokunin and is old art from way back in the history of Icarus. This was before I started YouTube and before I started doing TTRPG stuff. I got started with a sci-fi miniatures game, and that's where all of the art is from, and that's where a lot of the world building for this eventual game will be from this universe that I have had for like 15 years or longer than that. Oh, I feel like a mummy. So a lot of like the world that this game will be built on has existed for a long time. And then backgrounds, we've got Spacer, Colony Kid, Analyst, Scrapper, Military Cadet, and Academic. Very much these starting backgrounds and archetypes built to synergize together to make the pre-gen characters that use that art that we have here in Designer. So the goal is this suite of 6 pre-gen characters, each with their own personalities, each with their own goals tied to the starting adventure, and then secret goals as well. So each of them is going to be on the starter adventure for like a public reason and then a private reason. And that worked pretty well in the playtest. I don't think that I had enough kind of concrete information for the starter adventure. I think I had it as too much of a like sporadic note thing for that to really come into it. So for example, the mercenary, their kind of public goal is that they are looking for work because they've been betrayed by a former partner, former mercenary partner, but double crossed. And their secret goal is they're trying to get revenge, and they've heard that this secret partner is involved in the mission that the starter adventure is involved in. So the player then gets to have some role-playing moments as they go through the adventure. They encounter that character and they get to have that like little mini boss fight, and there is that payoff for that particular player. Similar with all of the characters. All of the characters have got some personal secret goal tied to the starter adventure, so that if you are playing through the starter adventure as one of the pre-generated characters, you could play through it 6 times and get 6 unique experiences, because each time you have a slightly different goal in addition to your main goal. So the starter adventure is kind of just a classic bounty. You've been hired to go and find this guy and bring him in. But then there's a bunch of intrigue sprinkled along the way. I don't think that I did a fantastic job in the first couple playtests of expressing the intrigue, because in the first playtest that we did, there was no mechanized action economy. So if we jump back into our Google Doc, and I find it somewhere, there it is, combat. So in the first playtest session, there was no initiative system. What have I just typed? Let's see. There was no initiative system. There was no like codified turns and rounds. There was also no specific action economy in terms of what you could do. It was way more open-ended and narrative, and the players really struggled with that. Now this was always going to be largely down to the individual players and the style of game that you and your group usually run. My players do prefer, by and large, a more rigid system, something more D&D and less powered by the apocalypse. But I think that it started way too open and narrative with the, you can do whatever you want on your turn, and then we'll figure out how to express it through an action roll to what is reasonable. There was always that sense from them that I don't know what to do, because I don't know what's too much, what isn't enough. I don't have the framework to build on here. So between the first and the second session, I spoke to them about it, and they universally said they would like at least some more rigid framework from it. So provisionally at the moment we have an initiative system that's rolling a number of dice equal to either your reflex or your intellect, and then totaling the result. I'm not super in love with that system, but it works enough for now. And then rounds and turns, pretty standard TTRPG parlance. And then when it comes to the action economy, you can move, interact, and make an action roll. So an action roll is where you're going to be making your attacks, anything that you've got a chance of failure in whenever you're combining your attributes and your skills. Moving, you can move up to near, or if you're playing with a grid, 8 squares. So that would be equivalent to like 40 feet. It's more movement than you would get in something like D&D, but that came as part of the balance of wanting to keep the language of close, near, far, so that people that don't play with the grid and that do more theatre of the mind don't have to worry about any of that, but also not hamstringing the weapons and forcing them to only be able to shoot like 6 squares because they can only shoot near. So near being 8 squares felt better than near being 6 squares. And when it came down to the crunch, I'd rather the players be able to move more and do more on their turn than do less, because that fits the design criteria of being pulp sci-fi. Hector says, as someone that began with 3.5 systems, vague with turns and combat mechanics feels so off. I even think my friends and I messed up Dagger Heart fight with our habits and assumptions. Yeah, it's when you come into, or when you come from quite rigid systems or very rigid systems, in the case of things like Pathfinder or 3.5 can be a confusing mess at times. Going into a narrative system can really be an adjustment. So I think having some kind of framework to be like, you can move, you can make an action roll, but you know, the prescription of what an action roll can be is quite wide. You know, the action roll, it can be attacking something, but it could be almost anything else. And there will be some specific guidance, and that's what a lot of this document, it's like 27 pages, like half of that is like descriptions of types of action rolls for each skill. I'll go up to that in a moment. Or you can forego your action roll to do a couple of different things, like move twice or mark a target, hug some cover, interact with an extra item. And then the interaction is you can do one thing that isn't an action roll per turn. So like opening a door, don't want to penalize someone for having to open a door. Drawing a weapon, again, it's not something you want to penalize someone for. Speaking a short amount, or using an item that doesn't require an action roll. That last one's a little bit nebulous. It will get more refined as we go along. I imagine it's going to end up being use a 1 slot item, and then I will design 1 slot items to be, these are the kind of things that you can use every turn. You know, like a smoke grenade, I'm happy with someone using with their interact action. A hand grenade, not so much. So smoke grenade, I'm happy to be a 1 slot item. Hand grenade would be 2 slots. And that's some of the usefulness of like bringing in hard mechanics for things. Being able to go around and go, where do I want the limitations for things? Where am I happy for things to be vague? Where do I want there to be a little bit more rigidity? Kedhub says, as much as I love narrative systems, it does involve a paradigm shift in the way that you play tiles sometimes, which is too much if you just want to chuck dice, kill things, and play a game. Exactly. Like, for some players, it's really difficult for them to shift out of the mindset of what they're used to, which is completely understandable. And also, if you are not used to that style, going in and being like, right, okay, you can do literally anything, can be a lot. So I think that the way I'm mainly approaching it now is trying to stay as narrative as possible, but with enough kind of framework and like mechanisms, so that when someone's like, well, no, I want to know, I want the list of things that I can do. Well, okay, the list is there. And like, speaking of lists, like I said, a big portion of what this doc is going to be listing out skills and suggested uses for the skills. So these aren't like these are the only things you can do with awareness. Like, for example, you can't just spot the details, read the room, or like it's a trap. These are suggested ways that you can use these skills. And the way I'm imagining this would be like several pages of spread in the final book to be like, if you struggle to think of how to creatively use your skills, this is where you want to come and read and think, oh, this is how I'm supposed to put these skills together. And then for the GM, you'll notice each of these has a complication. So if I find one that's complete, I think the hacking one has one. Terminal breach. Yeah, terminal breach has got one that's like finished. So terminal breach, suggested skill roll, right? So it's an action roll with the suggested attribute of intellect. So you'd roll intellect and hacking. The description is you attempt to gain unauthorized access to a secure digital system, bypassing firewalls, security layers, or data encryption. And then the complication, if you fail your action roll, you may, and then I have this broken down into an escalation of stakes, blocked progress, or succeed but. So like you would become flagged on the system, so security are now on their way to investigate. So you failed your role and now security are on their way, so soon you're going to have to deal with that problem. You failed your action roll, but you've become locked out of the system and triggered an alarm, so now you've got to deal with that problem. Or you failed the you failed your action roll, you've grabbed some minor information, but you've left behind a digital fingerprint, and you know you've left that behind. Which means that as the GM, you will be able to read the section and go, right, okay, if I am coming from a more rigid system where I'm more used to being like, right, you didn't roll a 16, so you just miss. This would give you some ideas of how to narrate the successes and failures, which is useful. Looks like you're using Google Docs as well. Found it worked well for designing until my editors started tackling almost 200,000 word document. It chugged with the editors. Yeah, this is not where my notes will live forever. This doc is mainly for my own benefit, because when I was running the playtests, I had all my notes across like 6 different places, and I needed to be able to put them somewhere for me to run. Once this gets a little further down the line, it will move into publisher, and I will be doing layout in place for publisher, which is how I do most of my writing. I do most of my work right into layout. It's very rare that I actually do Google Doc stuff, but this is so early in the process, I don't want to have to relay out again and again and again and again. So it's easier to just Google Doc it for now. So in terms of the kind of action economy, if we go back up to combat or down to combat, have the initiative roll, and then turns and rounds, and then on your turn you can move, perform an action roll, and make an interaction. Okay, like Taran, you designed during the layout. Yeah, it's how I've always preferred to do it. Well, not always, but for most of my career. I did one project where we had to do the layout at the end and had to make so many adjustments because the text wasn't quite fit into the layout. Either go back and do edits to add, a paragraph here, remove a paragraph there, or tweak the art that had already come in. And that process, after I went through that process, I was like, never again. I will just write to layout so that I at least always know that my text is where it is going to be from now on, because I never want to have to go through the process of trying to make things fit to the page again. It was miserable. So other things that I changed between sessions, changed a number of things like on the fly whilst we were playing. So initially the multiple successes that I talked about before, so when you roll more than 1 6 on an action roll, being able to deal extra damage, do a little bit of movement like move half your speed, target an enemy, hug cover, interact with an extra item, or allow a friend to succeed. Originally, I'd envisioned all of those things to cost adrenaline, and I had it in one of my 6 notes that it would cost adrenaline, but when we got into play, I missed that note, so I didn't put it into the actual playtest session. And after watching it play through without them costing adrenaline, I much preferred it, because it was encouraging the players to do cool shit so frequently. The last combat that we had of that second playtest session was the players in a cloning lab fighting a mech and a couple of goons, and it was so cool. Like, the players were sneaking under these cloning vats for cover. One of them jumped on top of the mech and blew its arm off, stole its arm, and used it as a mobile rocket pod. The scientist did this long wide flank, and then right at the end jumped on top and hacked the mech to kill it, which was amazing. Fully overloaded its circuits and did a load of hacking stuff to bring it down. And then a couple of the other characters were taking shots at it and stuff. Super cool. And having all of that without having to spend adrenaline to do the actual cool stuff, I think led to them doing more cool stuff, and I think sped combat up because there was more damage being done overall. There was more dice being rolled because they were marking targets. Marking targets was the kind of dark horse winner of that second play test, because it made a massive difference when you'd roll an extra 6, mark a target for your buddy, and then they'd be rolling 6 dice instead of 5, or rolling an extra dice vastly increases their percentage chance of hitting and their percentage chance of getting multiple successes, so then they can mark it. And it really helped the feeling of teamwork among the players as well, because they were always being right, I'll mark it for you, and then that player would do something, and then someone else would get a multiple success, and they'd do something that would lead into another player doing something else. And that is definitely something that I want to continue in as the design goes on, and I get more out of the kind of core mechanics elements and into the archetypes and the specific character abilities, is really giving them abilities that encourage them to do cool shit with each other. So for example, if we jump back into designer, I'll go through the abilities that they all had. Let me just make secret all of the secret goals that they've all got, so we don't have a bunch of spoilers. So the bounty hunter, as an example, their archetype feature is called "They're no good to me dead." So they can, whenever they reduce an enemy to 0 health, they can always choose for them to be out cold instead of dead, even when they're using deadly weapons. This came up really well in the very last scene in the second playtest, when they were trying to recover their target, and one of the enemies had taken the target hostage, and they were all working together as a group doing this awesome slow-mo play of one of them was flanking round. They were doing all of these different things at the same time, and what the bounty hunter did was they shot their bounty hunter target, because they cannot kill them if they don't want to. They can always choose for them to be out cold. So it's that moment in film where you choose to shoot the hostage and shoot through the hostage, or shoot the hostage to make them fall out of the way. So the bounty hunter shot the hostage, could not kill them because of their no good to me dead feature, which caused the hostage to move out of the way of the enemy. And then the mercenary used the rocket pod, which they'd blown off the mech, and shot the enemy and turned them into pink mist. It was a really cool moment. So I want a lot more features that encourage that kind of multiplay between, or that interplay between characters. The mercenary, their archetype feature is battle scarred, so whenever an enemy reduces their health in combat, they immediately gain an adrenaline token. So the mercenaries' core design ethos is they are the adrenaline machine. They're always gaining adrenaline, and they're encouraged to use it. So like their background ability is whenever they're using adrenaline tokens to give an ally a +1 modifier, they can do it at a cost of 1 adrenaline token instead of 2. So they are gaining adrenaline all the time, because whenever they take damage they gain adrenaline, which isn't something everyone else gets. But then they can also spend adrenaline much more freely, because they can spend it at a cheaper cost than everyone else. So like adrenaline is really the big deal to the mercenary, which led into changes when I was tweaking the character sheets between sessions. Originally the mercenary had lower nerve, and I ended up increasing their nerve and kind of like tweaking their starting attributes and completely dumping charm and reducing their intellect, because if they're going to be the adrenaline monkey and they want as much adrenaline as possible all the time, then they need the reservoir to be as big as possible, and that's determined by nerve, so they need a lot of nerve, which was just a fun like cyclical design thing. Miss Lexi, how are we? It's so late. I was to watch Labyrinth with a friend who'd never seen it before. That's an excellent choice, like getting to introduce someone to Labyrinth. Love that. So for the scientist, their feature is Ghost Cloak. So in the first playtest, this was just something that made them blanket invisible. If they were in combat and they didn't do anything, they were just invisible. And I changed it not necessarily because it was overpowered, but because I think it encouraged a style of play that was uninteresting. So I noticed in our first session, all it encouraged is the scientists to just sit back and not engage with the fight, because if they weren't engaged, they were invisible. So I changed the Ghost Cloak to be, while the shield is not overloaded, because it's also a shield, then they can add extra dice to any roll they make with stealth. So they are more stealthy as long as they aren't overloaded on their Ghost Cloak. And that just encourages, or it rewards stealth-based play, which is the intention for the Ghost Cloak, but it doesn't just remove them from a combat if they sit still. You know, they are still visible unless they make a stealth roll and succeed, and they have a better chance of succeeding, but it's not an automatic thing. And then their background ability, being able to automatically succeed an action roll with one of the abilities, that never actually came up. That was never used. It came up right at the end when they were hacking the mech to bring it down. They had the option to use this and just automatically succeed, but the player chose to roll, which I thought was really interesting. That at the moment of like peak tension, they chose to let the dice roll instead of using the feature that would guarantee them success. Now, they obviously knew that this was a one-shot and a playtest, so whether they would do this if they were running like a real long-term game, I don't know, but I did think it was interesting that they chose the spice versus the guaranteed success. Then for the smuggler, we have hidden compartments, so the smuggler gets an extra slot. If I change this, it will be 3 extra slots, and these are hidden slots on them, and any character that wants to make a search check on them, like using their awareness or investigation, has a penalty on that, just because they have hidden compartments on them, as all good smugglers should. And then they have the frontier trader ability, and that's their background ability. They have +1 bonus to action rolls made to make deals or trade. So the general goal with the starter characters is to give them like always useful thing, and then something that impacts them with dice. So like the hidden compartments is always on, and the frontier trader is dice based. The mercenary, they regain health, or they gain adrenaline when they lose health. It's always on. Their squad tactics is a situational thing. The corpo agent is, I think probably my favorite archetype ability. It's called We Own You, and whenever you make an action roll with influence or red tape, you can spend 1,000 credits to bribe the target, and you add 1 dice to the roll per 1,000 credits spent. And the whole purpose behind the corpo agent is more money than sense. You know, that corporate espionage, working for the machine. You know, the rich kid vibe. So they can't just throw money at the problem. And in that last scene in the second playtest, where the enemy had the hostage, the corpo agent started out by trying to bribe them, so throwing a stack of money on the floor to add a whole bunch of dice, and that's where we had the 9 dice. So they rolled 9d6 to try and influence this guy. Didn't roll a single 6, failed. And that's when the bounty hunter shot the hostage, and the mercenary used the rocket pod to turn the enemy into pink mist. Then their background feature is paper trail. You gain +1 dice to action rolls to uncover, forge, or manipulate paperwork and documents, because their background is the analyst. Then finally, we have the pilot. The pilot is the one that I will be changing, because their abilities are far too ship forward. So evasive maneuvers once per session. When an enemy scores a hit against the starship you're piloting, you can reduce the damage taken to 0. Really good ability, but we actually never encountered starship combat in our playtest session because the players kind of chose to opt out of it. They avoided all the situations that would have gotten them into space fights. And then Verse Traveler gives them a +1 on action rolls made to repair starship systems. Again, would have been really useful if they'd come into a starship fight. Excuse me. But because they didn't, it meant that the pilot was, if we're thinking of like power level and balance, the pilot was definitely the weakest in terms of the characters in our playtest session. And had the least impact round to round because of their abilities and the things that they had. So one thing that I want to do before the next playtest session is tweak the pilot's abilities. I'll probably move evasive maneuvers out and keep it as a choosable archetype feature for character advancement, and swap something in that gives them some benefit to reflex in a fight. So make them quick and nimble, and really focus in on the pilot being like the slippery fast one in a fight, because they don't have a lot of armor and their kind of role is going to be the quick mover within a combat. Then if we go over to here, also made a couple of little quick enemy cards. So this is something that I did between the first and second sessions, because in the first session I just had general scratch notes and found them to be quite difficult to interpret and use. So I wanted to make a couple of quick enemy scratch cards to be able to use as the foundation for how enemies will work in the system. So each one has health, armor, and shields. So health is HP, pretty explanatory. Armor is damage reduction. So if you are targeted, if you have -1 armor and you get hit by something that deals damage 3, you'll only take 2 damage. And then shields have also changed between playtest sessions. I'll come back to that. And then rather than list out every single skill, every single option, what I thought was I would do discrete numbers for the attributes and then give them a number of dice for skills, because the purpose for the enemies is they're here for a good time. They're not here for a long time. Like the goon, as an example, is specifically designed to survive for 2 shots. A standard light pistol deals 3 damage, so a goon will take 2 light pistol shots before they die, or if you shoot them with a shotgun, they'll die in 1. The goons are designed to be run like minions in hordes, lots of them. They are designed to go down really quickly for that pulp, fighting like the James Bond goons in the Moonraker base kind of vibe. So what I wanted from them was like quick moving combats. So your basic goon, no armor, no shields, will die in 1 to 2 hits. They have, when they're making like a shot or fighting, they're going to be rolling 4 dice, and if we double check our dice probability, that means they hit 52% of the time. So they're hitting about half the time, which means for like encounter balancing purposes, makes it quite nice and easy to figure out how much damage a goon is going to do, but from the player's perspective, doesn't feel like they're hitting too much. Excuse me. So on any given turn, a goon is only going to be really doing sort of 1 to 2 damage, once you account for their 50% hit rate. But they're going to be there in big numbers. Then the kind of soldier class, they get slightly better weapons, they have armor, and then as you go up the tiers, they get more health, more armor, bigger dice pools, better weapons, that kind of thing. The changes that I made to shields, so in the first playtest, shields essentially acted like a second hit point pool. So the corpo agent with shields 5, that essentially worked like a second hit point pool of 5 points of damage. So you could take 5 points of damage into your shield, the shield would overload, and then you start taking damage to your health. You could take that as like 1 damage in 1 turn, 1 damage in the second turn, and 3 damage in the third turn, and then it would overload, or any combination thereof. It has now changed to make shields more effective, because I found that the shields just weren't good enough. So shields are a lot better now, and the way that they work is you have to deal more damage than their value, equal to or more damage than their value, to overload them within a single turn. So the corpo agent has shields 5, which means from any and all sources within a single turn, she needs to take 5 points of damage or more to pop her shields. If she only takes 4 damage in a turn, her shields are fine, and they continue to be fine into the next turn. Someone's going to have to do 5 or more damage to her. It makes shields much, much more powerful, but it means that you can have characters like the corpo agent and like the scientist who have shields and no armor. They really rely on being in cover and not getting in the line of fire, because once their shields pop, they are really in trouble because they've got nothing else to reduce damage in terms of our starting characters. And that also means that we can tweak the values. So the Ghost Cloak, for example, was a different shield value initially. I think it might have even been, it might have been more powerful or less powerful. I can't remember, but it was a different value, and I tweaked it because the ability got worse. That was it. Yeah. So the shield value was 5, 3. The shield value is 3. My brain is really starting to leak out my ears. In the first playtest, the shield value for the Ghost Cloak was 3, and the Ghost Cloak just made you always invisible as long as you didn't like fight anything. When I made the ability for the Ghost Cloak worse, I made the shield value better to kind of offset it. And then as design goes on, I'll probably make it so that the dials that we have to turn in terms of shields are going to be whether or not you can wear them with armor, how much space they take up, and how much money they cost, obviously. So at lower levels, you're only going to be able to wear like really poor quality shields in addition to armor. You might be able to get a shield of 2 or 3 with armor, so it might protect you from a single gunshot, but then it'll overload, so you could wear it over something in a situation where you might get shot or stabbed unexpectedly, that kind of thing. But then if you wanted a more powerful shield, it's going to cost you way more credits or be much more bulky and use those as the kind of dials to turn to balance those things, and all of that will come out through playtesting. And then let's have a look at what else has changed. I feel like that's almost everything that has changed between the two sessions. And it's part of the reason why I think if you are working on a TTRPG or a game of any kind, if you're working on any kind of project, the quicker you can get something to playtesting, the better, because you are going to discover things that you had no concept of when it comes to playtesting, and the faster that you discover them, the better. And it's going to make the sooner you get into playtesting, the sooner the game's going to get better for a start. But it's also going to highlight where there are big gaps in the game. So, like I said before, for me, it was looking at things like the character sheet and noticing some of the accessibility issues with the character sheet. Things like the colors not being enough. I need to change out the colored dots for differently shaped and colored dots. Things like the inventory system being slightly confusing. Not necessarily confusing, but the players were misinterpreting the inventory system, and having to have it explained to them instead of just looking at it and understanding it. So therefore, I may as well, given I'm so early in the process, may as well change the inventory system, and that way I don't have to worry about that in the future. It will just be really clear on the character sheet what it means. So what I will probably do in the next couple of weeks is do another pass of the character sheets where I change out all the symbols and put in a little legend for architect background and free select with their color and their symbol. Rearrange inventory so that instead of being the 6x3 slots, it'd be 6 plus 3 times your strength. It will be 18 plus 9 times your strength slots, so 3 times as many. And then go through and codify and tweak how the interact action works so that it's specifically that you can use a 1 slot item as your interact action. And then I can go through all of the items that I have at the moment and decide, do I think that I want that to be able to be used on a turn in addition to an action roll? Do I want someone to be able to use their action roll and a stim? Probably. Do I want someone to be able to use their action roll and a tracking kit to put a tracker on someone? Maybe. Do I want someone to be able to use their action roll and throw a frag grenade? Definitely not. Frag grenade needs to be 2+ slots. Do I want someone to be able to use an action roll and drop a smoke grenade or a flashbang or like a non-offensive grenade? Maybe. So maybe those can be one, and it'll give me, I think that's going to give me a lot more flexibility in item design, because then that opens up the possibility of in the future being able to go, well, I could make a weapon that is 1 slot, and then you could be able to use your action roll for something and then use that 1 slot weapon. So I'm thinking like those like novelty small pistols that you see that like take up the size of your palm that have like 1 bullet in them, like a concealed one of them that could be used with your interact action that does 1 damage. In most situations, if you're in like a typical combat where you're fighting against anything of like soldier rank or above, they've all got armor, so that's not going to do anything. But if you find yourselves like go into a like masquerade ball and everyone's not got their armor and you can conceal that because it'd have the concealed tag, being able to like use your action roll on your turn and then pop that out with your interact action, that'd be pretty cool. Or given that you can use an additional interact action as part of multiple successes on an action roll, like doing an intimidation and multiple successes on that, and then as part of that whipping out your little derringer and firing it. I think there's a lot of interesting design space about that interact being using a 1 slot item that could be endlessly entertaining in the future. And it opens up the possibility for archetype features to be able to interact with that as well, and be like, well, maybe you could have an archetype that could interact with 2-slot items. I think that would open a whole can of worms for my brain, but it's a possibility. Because then you get to be able to introduce new features that really make archetypes feel unique, because they get to interact with elements of the game that either no one else gets to, or they get to like break core rules. So like, as an example, the mercenary gets to interact with adrenaline as a whole in a way that no one else does. They get way more adrenaline, and they can spend it in a way that no one else can. So those are the kind of things that I'm envisioning when it comes to like the character elements. It's going to be less about, you know, making the character big number go up, and more about making the characters like distinctly unique and do interesting and cool stuff that only they can do, or that takes their fantasy, the fantasy of being a bounty hunter, and takes it up to the nth degree, giving them features that are like, well, of course a bounty hunter is going to have the ability to always bring someone in alive instead of dead, that kind of thing. In terms of other options and other stuff on the list, that's the wrong button. Let's have a look at the contents and see if there's anything else that jumps out as being changed in between the playtest sessions, because my brain has turned into mush. I don't think so. The only things that I haven't mentioned, if we jump down to the example weapons table, I mentioned the kind of gold diamond, the special abilities for things like the SMG shooting multiple targets, the shotgun dealing extra damage at close range. That could also look like knives being able to be thrown up to near range, and I think that will probably be you can throw them at near range but with a penalty. And then there are silk blades, which are like monofilament weaponry that can be rigid like a sword, or can change to be like a whip. So they can be used at multiple ranges, close range as like the sword version, or you can use it at near range as like a whip. But they are very reflex based, so you have to have a minimum reflex score to be able to use them, because otherwise you're likely to lop your own arm off. Similar with like energy swords, like lightsaber style weapons, they will probably require a minimum reflex score, so that you don't just your own arm off while you're using them. And the other thing that I think I kind of codified, and I made a note of this while I was working on this yesterday evening, is when it comes to healing outside of combat. So in combat, players can use stims to recover, can spend adrenaline to recover, but outside of combat they can also use stims to recover. Initially I was going to have stims only do 1 healing, but players take quite a lot of damage when they take damage, so I think 3 makes more sense. And then medkits recover 6 health, so that's kind of medkits are the yang to the yin of the Hail Mary, which is the ability for you, after you've made your action roll, if you failed, you can look at your action roll and go, right, I want to pass that. You take 6 damage and it counts as you making a success with 1/6. So the med kit is like the opposite side of that coin, which will heal you for 6 health. Or you can recover 1 health per day of rest, and then finally you can seek professional services. So professional services, they will restore you to health fully and remove any of the conditions you have, and then it takes a different amount of time and credits depending on where you are, what the context is. But there is a recently treated box on the character sheet. So if we jump into the character sheet here next to health, there is a little recently treated tick box. So if you have been treated by a medkit or professional services, you cannot use either of those items again until the following session. And I've made a note that I'm going to have to eventually codify the kind of timeline of play, so what these terms mean, because sometimes a session might only encompass half of an adventure. So I think when I say session, I mean I don't necessarily mean a day, because time in a sci-fi system and a sci-fi setting is a bit wibbly wobbly. An hour somewhere isn't an hour somewhere else, or a day somewhere isn't a day somewhere else. So eventually I'll need to codify encounters, scenes, the smallest way in which you can interact with the game up to the largest way you can interact with the game. And once you've been treated by a med kit or a health kit, my intention is that you won't be able to use that again until next week, if you play every week, next session, to stop people just yo-yoing constantly, to encourage a little bit of not hesitation, but just a little bit of presence to go, okay, let's not go charging it like absolute mad lads. And then, like I said, I added that 6th condition so we could get a condition table and roll on that as well. I think that's pretty much everything that I changed between the 2 playtest sessions. So we've got 10 more minutes until the usual end time. So if you've got questions, thoughts, comments, throw them down in the chat below. I'll post the Discord link while I'm at it, and it's fresh on my mind as well. If you're looking for a place to chat with folks about all things TTRPGs, the Discord is a great place to go. My general plans with this moving forward is spend another probably couple weeks working on it on the side, to work out the tweaks that I've identified from these last couple playtest sessions, and then organize some more playtest sessions. The next one that I'm going to do is probably going to be with a bunch of other YouTubers, and if they're cool with it, I will try and record it, and if it is any even a little bit good, I will put it in the members only. I'll make it available to channel members, so you can see me running this very early version of the game. But it will be a while before that is done, because I'm currently fully in trying to redo the website at the moment, and that is taking all of my daytime work. So this is something that I'm working on purely on in the evenings and the weekends. Lexi says, what made you so passionate about accessibility? Was it always important to you, or did something make you realize why it's important? It's a really good question. I think it's always been important to me to a degree. I think that it's become a lot more important in the last several years as I have become more unwell. So I have always been around people who have had accessibility needs to a degree. But as I myself have started to require accessibility considerations over the last couple of years increasingly, it's become more important to me. But in general, I think that any time that you're making something more accessible, you're just making it better for everyone. With the example, if we jump back into the view of the character sheet, making this character sheet more accessible from the point of view of adding color coding and eventually changing the color coding to also be shaped so it accounts for people with color deficiency, also means that if someone prints that off in black and white, it is immediately more usable, regardless of whether they themselves have accessibility needs. It is just more usable for everyone, and that's something that I've consistently found. Any time that I make any design with accessibility in mind, the end result is always more usable for everyone. And when as soon as I realize that, and when I think about it like that, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't always be trying to do it as accessible as I can. It's never perfect, and it's never going to be perfect, and there's always ways in which things could be better. For the longest time, like, none of my PDFs were accessible in any way because Affinity did not have the tools to do it. That's why at the moment, going through and sorting the website, I've been on a real tangent of like remastering all of the old issues of SideQuest. And part of that is to unify like the trade dress and update the content. And part of it is also because none of the old issues, like the first like 25, 26 issues, just had nothing in the way of accessibility because the app did not support the tools for alt text and all of that kind of stuff when those initial issues were made. But by going back and doing it now, it just makes it better for everyone, because if you're loading it in like a web viewer and it doesn't load, the alt text is going to load first, so you actually know what it's going to say and all that kind of stuff. And I think it also consistently designing with accessibility in mind makes you a better designer. Goop says, please can my new D&D character be an elephant man? Absolutely not. You know that the Loxodon are strictly banned. No Loxodon. If it's the one thing I become known for as being the Loxodon hater, I'm fine with it. Like, I will take that legacy with me. I am Loxodonist, and I'm fine with that. They have no place in our world. Other worlds is fine, but Ishtar has no room for Loxodon. At this point, it has also become a meme. But no, I think that anytime that you are designing with accessibility in mind, it also like improves your design, because as an example, if we jump into let me find the page with it before I turn this on. Desktop and publisher. So this is a work in progress page from like example layout of the interior of how the sci-fi game might look. And if we throw on a contrast checker, you can immediately see that the color differences between the symbols are just not enough to be able to tell them apart. So the obvious choice is you use different symbols. Like if all of the symbols for close, near, far, extreme were the same color, they would be useless in black and white. But because all four of them are different symbols, they are as usable in color as they are in black and white. Goop, I don't think we are playing tomorrow, if I recall. I did post in the game planning chat last week with dates. I think it's next week we're doing character creation for D&D. Got like 5 more minutes. So if anyone else has questions, queries, thoughts, throw it in the chat below while I hydrate. And choke on the really cold water. Oh my god. Everything's fine. Holy moly. Oh my god. Dang. Oh my god. That proper went down the wrong way. In terms of videos and things coming, there's going to be a new members only video coming tomorrow. It's going to be a story time video talking about a story from one of my previous campaigns. There is no main channel video this week. Next week depending on how my schedule is looking, I am hoping to put the video for Dragon's Delves out. I'm not 100% sure of what that video is going to look like, whether it's going to be like, here is the review for Dragon's Delves, or whether it's going to be, here is how we fix that first scenario. I'm leaning towards the latter because I think it's more usable for people. I think that just a general, oh, here is my thoughts on the book, it's fine, but it's not really adding anything of value to your lives. Whereas if we can sit down and go through the first adventure and be like, right, okay, here's what's wrong with it, here's how to understand what's wrong with it, here's how you can read an adventure and immediately pick up on these things. Because for those of you that were in the stream a couple weeks ago where we took our first look at Dragon's Delves, very quickly I was able to like register that adventure was not fit for the level that they were intending. So a video that was kind of like how to do that, how to identify whether it's like fit for level, and then how to make those adjustments, because the text doesn't give you that instruction, I think is much more usable than just here's what I thought of the book. So that's probably where I'm leaning. Coop says, how'd you get people to play in your D&D games for so long? You don't give them a choice. You say, we are playing on Wednesdays, and that is when we are playing. And then we're only not going to play if I can't play. It's worked pretty well so far. Otherwise, you just rigid schedules. I've already put a link to the Discord in the chat, but I'll throw another one down there. I'll also throw a link to my Drive-Thru RPG where you can pick up a whole bunch of free and paid resources if you're looking to grab stuff to help improve your game. But given that we are coming up on 10 o'clock, I'm going to call it there. I hope that you've enjoyed this evening and you've got some insights for game design and all of that good stuff. I have been Anto, you have been wonderful, and I shall catch you later. But until next time, happy gaming.